I live on the East Coast of the United States, and if I'm on the beach doing a ritual, to me it seems kind of weird and silly to put water in the west if the water's lapping at my heels from the east. So I might rearrange it as well. But if I had a choice, I prefer this kind of alchemal air, earth, water, fire opposition. But I know that's different from most places, and I have students that have learned traditional ways and are really about the cycle of the seasons, and or even the cycle of the day from dawn to noon, and noon should be the hottest point, and so it should be fire, and then west in the water, and earth in the north. But a big point of the Temple of High Witchcraft is that as long as you have a reason to understand the symbolism, and as long as that symbolism works for you, and ultimately as long as you get results, then that's the biggest test. And there's going to be a lot of innovators out there that will do things differently, but if they get results from it, that becomes part of a tradition that gets passed on. If they don't get results from it, nobody else gets results from it, it doesn't get passed on.
Now, are you familiar with Crowley's Star Ruby ritual?
Yes, I am. I'm not intimately in the sense that I perform it regularly, but I am familiar with it. We're going to be touching upon that a bit in the Temple of High Witchcraft. I actually got permission from, I'm not sure exactly his name, but one of the elders in the OTO tradition that gave me permission to reprint it. I'm very excited about that.
Well, but within that, it actually it has the opposition that you're talking about.
And it also has the Widdershins movement, which I find very interesting.
Right. So within your tradition, do you go Deosil or Widdershins?
We go Deosil.
Okay. Mm-hmm. So you put...
Although I don't, some witches freak out if you do something Widdershins. I think if I was going to do a big banishing ritual, if I wasn't creating temple, I probably wouldn't mind going Widdershins, just from my own theology and from my own kind of... I think you sometimes get programmed with whatever you first are exposed to that seems the most right to you. Mm-hmm. But I know a lot of witches tend to freak out if you do anything Widdershins. I think you can do magic Widdershins as well, and depending on what the intention is behind it, I think that's often the most important part.
So since the listeners of this podcast are primarily thelemic, what do you say in your book about the Star Ruby?
Well, basically it's in an appendix. I'm not really, dissecting it or reading great commentary to it, but what each lesson will do, like the Malkuth lesson, will have the Lesser Banishing Ritual of the Pentagram, and in the corresponding appendix in the back will say, here's other versions of the pentagram ritual. And, some that I found one, and someone gave me permission that has a very Celtic feel to it. I have the Star Ruby into it. I also have the Star Sapphire for the hexagram rituals. So I show different versions of how people have deconstructed and reconstructed certain rituals and what's worked for them and what's been passed on and what necessarily hasn't. So people can kind of look at that, and if they decide to try a different tradition, they'll have some information there. Mm-hmm. And if they don't, they can have some inspiration to construct their own.
Okay. Do you address Thelema at all within the Temple of High Witchcraft?
We definitely talk about it in the context of the history of ceremonial magic, and I think of Aleister Crowley as a huge, huge influence on modern witchcraft. And I know a lot of modern witches don't like to think about that or admit to that. But I think there's that definite crossover with the Gerald Gardner connection, and there's vast debates amongst witchcraft scholars of exactly what his influence was and what his role was. But I think spiritually, he had just a great influence on modern witchcraft, and specifically that book. When you look at Aleister Crowley's life, I think he's so much of an innovator, and the sense that he was, even when you take that line, every man and every woman is a star, the idea that finding that direct center of your own solar system, the own center of your universe, being your own light, being your own center, that ultimately you have to figure out what works best for you, and I think he was the best example of that. So I actually hold him up to my students as somebody, to emulate, in the sense of you can create your own magical paradigms if you feel called to do that, and look at some of his work to see how he took traditional things and transformed them and changed them, and really had a blend of both knowing intellectually how things worked and really knowing his stuff, but also having that spiritual inspiration of he just didn't decide to redo things, but there was that divine providence, there was that divine inspiration to say this is what's coming through me, and to really have people find their own way, find their own light through that.
Well, you've talked about a lot of your practices in the background and how it was non-conventional in some ways. How do you apply these elemental aspects or the various directions and things like that? How do you apply them to your rituals that you do in the construction of your rituals?
Like the oppositions of earth, air, and fire and water?
Right, and then also the use of the elemental weapons. I'm assuming because of the change, you're putting the sword in the east. I'm sorry, you're putting the wand in the east and the sword and then the dagger in the south. Is that correct? Mm-hmm. So, what other kind of modifications do you do to your rituals that incorporate those kind of changes?
Honestly, I don't think there's a huge amount of... I think if you went to my ceremonies, you'd notice differences. If you're familiar with more kind of straight-on Wicca, you'd be familiar with a lot of the aspects. I don't think I change things completely radically. But what I think it does change the energy. Like, people have come to my public rituals in the Boston area. I publicly celebrate the 8 Sabbats, and people are welcome to come to that. As a bookstore down there hosted in Cambridge. And people who have not been to the rituals before really notice a certain intensity to that elemental correspondence. And some really don't like it and never come back, and others really enjoy it. We do a lot of personal transformation work in my rituals in general and in my public rituals. And I think that opposition of elements really aids to that. But I still associate blades with air and wands with fire. I know some people have it switched. Mm-hmm. But I think the Great Rite, I still do with the cup and the blade. Although I've been in ceremonies that we've done it with the wand as well, and I think that has a different energy to it. And I don't think it's necessarily bad, but it's not the way I prefer. Again, I think sometimes you're programmed with what you're used to, and when I was first trained, it was the blade and the cup. But I don't think the shifting of the directions alters that symbolism or that feel for me.
Now, when you were mapping the elements to the lower spheres on the tree, mm-hmm. what kind of lessons or what kind of things do you touch on in your book about Tiphereth and above?
Well, the higher you go, the more nebulous they become, don't they? Mm-hmm. I look at Tiphereth as really the spirit aspect of it and communing with your holy guardian angel and really getting to the mysteries of sacrifice. The lessons were much thicker. It was much easier to write after we got to that point because there's only so much you could say, and the lessons became shorter. The earlier lessons really get into not only working with the elemental weapons, but through visionary work and working with the elemental planes, finding those elemental weapons within. The way the 5 books, the Temple series kind of work, they're almost like octaves of each other, where 1 and 3 have very similarities to it. 2 and 4 have a lot of similarities. And in the second level, in the Outer Temple of Witchcraft, we dealt a lot with communing with the elemental planes. And, I believe before people should go calling on the elements, they should actually have contact with the elements. And so what we do in the level 4 is now I'm assuming that people have continued those relationships and have been working with the elemental planes. What I really want them to do is then, find within themselves through working with the air teachers that sort of truth. I want them to find the stone of sovereignty or the pentacle of sovereignty. I want them to find, the wand or the spear of victory, kind of borrowing from some Celtic imagery because that really speaks to a lot of my witchcraft. And really finding that holy grail or that cup of compassion. And then once you get beyond that, the kind of ritual challenges were a lot more nebulous. So it was the idea that we commune and do a path working up to Tiphereth. We do a ritual to invoke the holy guardian angel and to commune with it. But it wasn't the same, quite a challenge. I actually kind of put a preface in the book that if you can't get through the first 4 and feel comfortable with the first 4 elements, then don't continue on with the book until you have that mastery, then you can go onward. Mm-hmm. I really got a lot into Gabora. Gabora, I think, is something that I've been really always struggled with in my life, with the whole Martian energy. So it was really nice to talk about that. There was a bit of relating Gabora to the scourge and witchcraft and the traditions that use the scourge and the idea of suffering to learn, but also the kind of breaking down power. And I think a lot of Kabbalistic sources also look at Gabora as very feminine and kind of dark goddess, destructive war goddess aspect to it, which a lot of people, when they think Mars, automatically assume male figure. So we kind of explored both genders of Gabora. So I had a lot of fun with that as well.
And then when you got to the supernals, what kind of things did you look at there?
Well, the supernals are really, in our theology and kind of the witchcraft that I teach, we have this concept of divine mind or great spirit or whatever word you want to have to it, and really relating what was taught in the previous books about that to Kether, and then looking at that as divided as, a primal goddess figure and a primal god figure, and looking at Bina and Hokma like that. And really kind of looking at their union and the idea of Hokma being the seed and Bina being the great primal ocean or fertile cosmos, and through that everything coming through. So I really kind of looked at them as that. In fact, you have Tiphereth and Gabora and Hesed, and they were more nebulous than the ones that were before that, but then once you got to the supernals, that was even more nebulous. It was about having that direct experience. In the end, I think there's a lot of things you can't put into words, but really having people commune with those energies. I know a lot of people would say, well, they're above the abyss, you can't commune with them. But if we have our kind of microcosmic tree in whatever sphere we're anchored in at the time, I think you can touch an aspect of Kether. It's not Kether, it's not enlightenment, but you can get a sense of what that energy is for you, where you're at right now.
What kind of rituals did you design with that? Are they more type of meditations or path working?
There are a lot of path working meditations, and I'll bring them through the different paths, and specifically working on the tarot imagery, because the outer temple of witchcraft dealt a lot with tarot, so I felt like this was taking it to the next octave of understanding tarot. And then there's actually going to be CDs that go along with it, and the way I do it in class and the way I assume that I'll have the CDs, and we're in the midst of recording in a few weeks, will really be about, giving the person a lot of space to experience things directly. So the higher you go up on the tree, the less descriptive I become, just to let people have their own experience with it. And honestly, when I do a lot of path workings, I leave a lot of space anyway, because I believe if I say something and that's not what you see, that's fine. Once you've made communion with the energy, once we've done certain things to connect with it, once we've vibrated the God name, I definitely encourage people to light the appropriate incenses and build an altar to whatever lesson we're working at that time. So it's the colors and the incense and number of candles that corresponds with the same color. And if it was just sod, I'll have the 9 purple candles or whatever it may be to really invoke that energy. And once they've communed with it, then just have an experience. And it doesn't so much matter what I say, but what they envision and what they experience is the most important part.
Okay. Well, we've talked a lot about the Tree of Life and ceremonial magic, and you've made references to kind of the god and goddess and various genders, but one of the things that is interesting about what you've worked with is you also have a book called Gay Witchcraft, Empowering the Tribe. Right. And you're very vocal about your sexuality. Mm-hmm. So where do you see gender and or gender identity versus actual physical gender? How does that work in with your magical practices that you have noticed within your experience and also your students?
Well, I again, one of the strange things when I look back on my training and the things that I got from it and the things that I didn't, as I started to kind of go more out in the world, I realized that certain forms of witchcraft, in particular certain forms of more kind of British traditional witchcraft, had more of a gender bias, had more specific roles of this is what a man did in the ceremony, and this is what a priest's role was, and this is what the priestess's role was. And a lot of the training that I had from my teachers it wasn't that coven lineage based. It was like, here are the tools that you need, and you can practice in a group, you can practice, a lot of us were practicing solitary, so it was how do you do the great rite alone? How do you enjoin both goddess and god alone? It was really drilled into me early in magical training that we all have that bisexual polarity current. We all have goddess and god. We all have male and female. We all have yin and yang. And a good witch or a good magician can, really direct which current that they need at that time. So I was never really stuck on specific gender roles. And it wasn't until I went more outside of my immediate community that I started to be faced with that. So my own personal practice, I'd say, doesn't really, not that it doesn't reflect, I think a lot of people think I'm a little bit more vocal about orientation and gender identity than I am. And not that that's a bad thing, it's just that was one aspect of something I felt I needed to bring to light, but it doesn't play a huge aspect in my personal practice. My partner, my husband, practices witchcraft and magic as well, and we'll do rituals together, and although we're doing rituals together, and one may be holding the chalice and embodying the goddess or embodying the god, we're not stuck on those roles. I actually am I kind of think of it as a very Aquarian coven, and we have rotating leadership and are very avant-garde for most traditional witchcraft covens. And, the role of leading the ceremony of 2 people, and priest and priestess, can be taken by anybody of any gender, and the coven's mixed. It's not an entirely gay or lesbian coven. We've got gays, we've got lesbians, we've got bisexuals, we've got straight people, we've got married people, we've got single people, we've got polyamorous people. It's a very kind of hodgepodge, and anybody can take whatever role they want. So, I might be doing a ritual with another priest, and he might be embodying the goddess and be completely straight, and we just don't get hung up on those things. I think it's really important for every man to get in touch with the goddess and the god. Actually, for me, in many ways, it was easier to get in touch with the goddess because I was really running from Catholicism and the image of God the Father. And it took me a long time in witchcraft to be comfortable with the idea of the god, because I think a lot of witchcraft traditions, and even when I started, even if there was an emphasis of goddess and god, everybody's meditations focused on the goddess, everybody's chants focused on the goddess, everybody's imagery and visualization focused on the goddess, and the god was just something, you had to call on the god, but nobody really had the deep, direct relationships, or at least nobody was talking about them. And so for me, it was a real challenge as a man and as a gay man to get really in touch with the god energy. I think something that was really pivotal for me was that I was invited out, once Gay Witchcraft came out, to a gay men's festival in Ohio called Between the Worlds. And I actually was quite nervous to go out there because, one, to have a group of a small festival of really intense pagans and witches and magicians can be kind of tough. Sometimes the bigger festivals are easier because you can disappear when you want to. And then having a group of it be all exclusively gay and bisexual men people who identified as queer in some way, was really intense, and the sense of brotherhood and the sense of